in Westminster. And one of the greatest miracles of the 20th century, the miracle of falling mortality and rising lifespans, is no longer delivering for everyone and is now faltering or reversing. Yet when people say that they're worried about inequality, it is frequently unclear what they mean or why they care. Economists think they know what they mean when they talk about inequality, and they produce charts of Gini coefficients of income and of wealth. And when other social scientists say that they have wider concerns, economists, among whom I have counted myself, have often been too ready to tell them that they don't know what they're talking about. What we would like to do in this review, even with its large quota of economists, is to get better understanding of exactly what it is that bothers people about inequality. We will also think about how we might address concerns about inequality, and indeed, which concerns need to be addressed. If the concern with inequality is simply envy, as is often claimed on the right, it is perhaps better to address the concern than to address the inequality. If the inequality comes from incentives that work for a few but benefit many, then we may want to do a better job of documenting the need for incentives and what they do for the economy as a whole. If working people are losing out because corporate governance is set up to favor shareholders over workers, or because the decline in unions has favored capital over labor, and is undermining the wages of workers at the expense of shareholders and corporate executives, then we need to change the rules. And why are the myriad differences between men and women so persistent and so difficult to erase? Given that we're just starting, it is perhaps presumptuous of me to say anything substantive at this point. But what I'm going to say is what I myself think, or at least what I think today, and I look forward to changing my mind as we go. I wouldn't be chairing this review if I didn't expect that to happen in a very serious way. I'm also perhaps too much influenced by my own work, particularly my recent work with my colleague Anne Case, and this work is primarily about the United States, though we have been doing quite a bit of thinking over the last 6 months about how it applies to Britain. At the risk of grandiosity, I think that today's inequalities are signs that democratic capitalism is under threat, not only in the US, where the storm clouds are darkest, but in much of the rich world, where one or more of politics, economics, and health are changing in worrisome ways. I don't believe that democratic capitalism is beyond repair, nor that it should be replaced. I'm a great believer in what capitalism has done, not only to the oft-cited billions who have been pulled out of poverty in the last half-century around the world, but to all the rest of us who have also escaped poverty and deprivation over the last 2.5 centuries. It also provides our jobs and the cornucopia of goods and services that we take for granted. And Milton Friedman, whose starry-eyed view of capitalism has much to answer for, was not entirely wrong when he extolled the freedom that free markets can bring. Though history has not been kind to his view that equality would be guaranteed by using the market to pursue freedom. But we need to think about repairs for democratic capitalism, either by fixing what is broken or by making change to head off the threats. Indeed, I believe that those of us who believe in social democratic capitalism should be leading the charge to make the repairs. As it is, capitalism is not delivering to large fractions of the population. In the US, where the inequalities are starkest, real wages for men without a 4-year college degree have fallen for half a century, even at a time when per capita GDP has robustly risen. Mortality rates are rising for the less educated group at ages 25 through 64, and by enough that the life expectancy for the entire American population has fallen for 3 years in a row. The first time such a reversal has happened since the end of the First World War and the great influenza epidemic. Just let me say that again, 3 years in a row, life expectancy has fallen, and that has not happened for 100 years. And we're not talking about a narrow group, we're talking about life expectancy at birth for the whole American population, rich and poor, taken together. Less educated Americans are dying by their own hands from suicide, from alcoholic liver disease, and from drug overdoses. Morbidity is rising too, and they're also suffering from an epidemic of chronic pain that for many makes a misery of daily life. In Britain, these inequalities are not so stark, at least not yet. But median real wages in Britain have not risen for more than a decade. 1 decade is much better than 5 decades. But we surely do not want to wait to find out whether the American experience will be replicated here. There have also been prolonged periods of real wage stagnation in recent years in Italy and in Germany. In those countries too, increasing overall prosperity is not reaching everyone. And as I noted above, democracy too does not seem to be working for everyone. The sense of being left behind, of not being represented at Westminster is much the same as the sense of not being represented in Washington. In Clement Attlee's 1945 cabinet, the cabinet that implemented the Beveridge Report and built the first modern welfare state, there were 7 men who had begun their working lives at the coalface. When Labour MPs from Glasgow set off to London, local bands and choirs came to the train station to see them off, as if they were going to war, which indeed they were. Only 3% of MPs elected in 2015 were ever manual labourers, compared with 16% as recently as 1979. The union movement, which once produced talents like those in Attlee's cabinet, has been gutted by the success of post-war meritocracy. Attlee's warriors would today have gone to university and become professionals. They would never have been down the pit, nor in a union hall. Meritocracy has many virtues, but as predicted by Michael Young in 1958, it has deprived those who didn't pass the exams not only of social status and of the higher incomes that degrees bring, but even of the kind of political representation that comes from having people like themselves in Parliament. Young wrote, quote, "The bargaining over the distribution of national expenditure is a battle of wits, and defeat is bound to go to those who lost their clever children to the enemy." He referred to the less educated group as the populists, who, in turn, referred to the elite as the hypocrisy. A very splendid term. What does history tell us? Not surprisingly, we've been here before. There have been several episodes where capitalism seemed broken, but was repaired, either on its own or by deliberate policy, or by some combination of the two. In Britain at the beginning of the 19th century, inequality was vast compared with today. The hereditary landowners not only were rich, but also controlled Parliament through a severely limited franchise. After 1815, the notorious Corn Laws prohibited imports of wheat until the local price was so high that people were at risk of starving. High prices of wheat, even if they hurt ordinary people, were very much in the interests of the land-owning aristocracy, who lived off the rents supported by the restriction on imports. The Industrial Revolution had begun. There was a ferment of innovation and invention, and national income was rising. Yet working people were not benefiting. Mortality rates rose as people moved from the relatively healthy countryside to stinking, unsanitary cities. Each generation of military recruits was shorter than the last, as their childhood nutrition worsened, from not getting enough to eat and from the nutritional insults of unsanitary conditions. Church-going fell, removing a major source of community and support for working people, if only because churches were in the countryside, not in the new industrial cities. Wages were stagnant and would remain so for half a century, like today. Profits were rising, and the share of profits in national income rose at the expense of labor. It would have been hard to predict a positive outcome of this process. Yet by century's end, the Corn Laws were gone. The rents and fortunes of the aristocrats had fallen along with the world price of wheat. Reform Acts had extended the franchise from 1 in 10 males at the beginning of the century to more than a half by its end, although the enfranchisement of women would have to wait until 1918. Wages had begun to rise in 1850, and the more than century-long decline in mortality had begun. All of this happened without a collapse of the state, without a war or a pandemic, though gradual change in institutions that slowly gave way to the demands of those who'd been left behind. Good story. Sort of. America's first Gilded Age is another case. It also shows that the fundamental rules of the game can be changed. In the Progressive era, 4 constitutional amendments were passed, all designed to limit inequality in one form or another. One instituted the income tax. One gave women the vote. One prohibited alcohol, strongly supported by women who believed that alcoholic abuse was an instrument of their oppression. And one, an electoral reform that instituted the direct election of senators, as opposed to their previous appointment by state legislatures that were often dominated by business. I already mentioned the case that is most on my mind, the construction of the modern welfare state by Attlee's government after the Second World War. The Great Depression, like the stagnation of wages in the early 1800s, spawned a large literature on how to modify or abolish capitalism. And according to one version of the story, it was Attlee's government that tamed the beast, and that made it possible for the tamed beast to deliver the unprecedented growth, shared growth, that many of us grew up upon. Joe Stiglitz has recently written that he grew up in the golden age of capitalism. Very odd statement. Though, as he wryly notes, it was only later that he discovered that it was the golden age. And of course, it wasn't really a golden age, at least in terms of material living standards or in terms of health. But perhaps it was in terms of the rules of the game that allowed the growing post-war prosperity to be widely shared. I don't think that anyone would argue that the late 1940s was a golden age in Britain. There was bread rationing, petrol rationing, and to young Angus Deaton, the terrible deprivation of sweet rationing. But the safety net that was built in those years played a role in fairly sharing, and perhaps even in helping generate the prosperity that was to come. That safety net is needed just as much today. Globalization and automation are challenging us today just as they did in the early 19th century. Safety nets are most needed when change is rapid, and is one of the reasons why America is doing so much worse, most obviously in deaths of despair, than our wealthy European countries. But what is happening today is also a real threat to Britain and to Europe. The argument that Ann Case and I are making in our new book is that less educated white men and women in America had their lives progressively undermined starting in the 1970s and showing up since 1990 in rising numbers of deaths from suicide, alcoholic liver disease, and accidental drug overdoses. African Americans experienced a similar disaster 30 years earlier, and the improvements in their lives since then have protected them to an extent. In the face of globalization and innovation, many of us would argue that American policy, instead of cushioning working people, has instead contributed to making their lives worse by allowing more rent seeking, reducing the share of labor, undermining pay and working conditions, and changing the legal framework in ways that favor business over workers. Inequality has risen not only due to wealth generation from innovation or creation, but also through upward transfers from workers. It is not inequality itself that's hurting people, but the mechanisms of its enrichment. It's how inequality happens, not the inequality itself. So how much of this is a threat to Britain? Some of the mechanisms of enrichment are not operative here. The US wastes about $1 trillion a year on a healthcare system that is very good at enriching providers, hospitals, device manufacturers, and pharmaceutical companies, but very bad at delivering health. You do not have that problem. The US has licensed pharma companies to sell opioids to the general public, including for chronic pain, which ignited an epidemic of addiction and death with a cumulative toll that is now larger than all Americans lost in both world wars. You too use opioids, but usually in hospitals, not in the general population. Yet the opioid manufacturers are following the model of tobacco manufacturers and working hard when blocked in the US to expand elsewhere. Purdue Pharmaceutical has a subsidiary, Mundi Pharma, that agitates on behalf of the greater pain relief that they argue opioids can bring. As I write this, Matt Hancock, the Minister of Health, noted that things are not as bad here as in America, but we must act now to protect people from the darker side of painkillers. So people here know that it's a problem. The BBC News report on this carries a chart showing the extraordinary geographical inequality in opioid prescriptions in England, with prescription rates 5 times larger in Cumbria and the Northeast than in London. As the briefing note for this launch shows, deaths of despair are rising in Britain, particularly in less successful parts of Britain, just as they are in other English-speaking countries, although the numbers and death rates are small compared with the US. What about wages? The US has extensive business lobbying, which you do not have, or certainly not in the same way. The US also had very little lobbying prior to 1970, which is something that's not widely understood. So it could happen here too. It's not something that's endemic to the way the US Constitution was written. As in the US, unions have become much less powerful in Britain, a decline that many have welcomed, but their countervailing power in boardroom decisions may have protected wages and working conditions. Unions provided social life and political power for many people who have less of both today. The replacement of stakeholder capitalism by shareholder value maximization is widespread in the US and has been remarked on here too. Paul Collier, in his recent book, has noted that Imperial Chemical Industries, ICI, once the crown jewel of British industry, used to boast, quote, "We aim to be the finest chemical company in the world." But that before it was lost to takeovers and mergers in 2006, it had changed its slogan to, "We aim to maximize shareholder valuation." They weren't very good at that either. In Britain, as in America, some cities and towns are doing much better than other cities and towns. And the easy mobility that tended to keep these differences in check seems to have been much reduced. America is no city that is dominant or as uniquely prosperous as London. Political dysfunction in Britain is different, but there is a common thread that many voters believe that they're not well represented. And there are sharp differences across groups with age, education, ethnicity, gender, and geography important in both countries. For me, I think that people getting rich is a good thing, especially when it brings prosperity to others. But the other kind of getting rich, what you might call taking rather than making, rent-seeking rather than creating, enriching the few at the expense of the many, taking the free out of free markets is making a mockery of democracy. In that world, inequality and misery are intimate companions. Thank you very much.
It is rare that a scholarly work is able to significantly impact the national conversation, but a recent paper on what has come to be described as the deaths of despair, the increase in deaths among middle-aged white Americans with a high school education, has had a significant impact on the political and policy conversations in this country. Our next guest is co-author of that paper. Ann Case is the Alexander Stewart 1886 Professor of Economics and Public Affairs at Woodrow Wilson School of Public and International Affairs and the Economics Department at Princeton University. She co-authored a paper on this topic with her husband, Angus Deaton, also an economist and recipient this year of the Nobel Prize. Ann Case joins us now to discuss their work. Professor Case, thanks so much for coming on the program.
My pleasure. Good to be here.
Thank you. And you know, I guess one of the first questions I wanted to ask you before we get into the details of this study, did you have any idea when you went in to look at these mortality rates what a compelling story they would tell, or indeed that they would tell a story at all?
Well, I think neither of us had any idea. We started kind of around the edges. We were looking at pain on one side of it to see what was happening to pain among middle-aged Americans. And for a very different project, we had started looking at suicide just to see whether or not the suicide numbers would corroborate numbers on people's self-reported happiness. And but as we started to look at the numbers and we started to look, say, back in time and realize that there were really serious changes going on, we started to dig deeper. And when we got to the point where we realized that all-cause mortality, so mortality from any cause, among whites in middle age were beginning to rise, and that is something that was totally unexpected, especially given that it had been falling for 50 years. It continues to fall in all of the other kind of comparison sister countries to the U.S. So it was a total surprise for us.
One of the things that I think was striking for some of us hearing about this study is that for many of us, we've had a belief, particularly if we've been alive for a while in the United States, had the belief that life expectancy is one of those ever-improving situations. As you say, we've had 50 years of improvement. I think the assumption somehow was that this was going to continue to improve as medicine got better and as technology got better and so on. So I think one of the reasons, there are a number of reasons why this study I think has had such an impact, but I think one of the reasons is that it feels as if it challenged a deeply held assumption on the part of the American people about the optimistic nature or the optimistic prospects for the future of this country. So I know we're getting a little afield from the data, and I want to get back to the data, but did that strike you as well, or do you have any thoughts on that?
It certainly did, and I'm afraid I have to be academic here for a second, which is that life expectancy continues to improve. Because life expectancy, it takes place, it's a snapshot over all ages. So what we're talking about is actually death in middle age, so really the mortality rates in middle age. And those had been falling at about 2% a year for the last 50 years. And so, and I think, and again, this is getting a little bit ahead of the data, but I think that people in the U.S. anticipate that their lives are going to be better, that their children's lives will be even better than their lives. And certainly one big component of that is how long they're going to well and how long they're going to live and how well they're going to be while they live. And so the idea that that starts to move in the wrong direction, I think, is the reason that it really got a lot of people's attention.
Yes, and to be clear, Professor Case, and we're talking with Ann Case, co-author of the study on the increasing death rates for middle-aged, high school-educated white Americans. While they are getting, while these statistics are getting worse for this particular group of people, for other groups of people, they may be continuing to improve, but their baselines are maybe different. For example, for minority Americans and so on. Correct?
That's exactly right. So African Americans started the late 1990s with a much higher mortality rate in middle age than did, say, white non-Hispanics. But their mortality rates have been falling quite dramatically and continue to do so. So, for example, the Centers for Disease Control every year report on the gap between white and black life expectancy or white and black mortality rates, and that gap has been closing. But part of the reason that gap has been closing is because the mortality rates of whites have been going up since the late 1990s. Hispanics, and I think this comes as a surprise to a lot of people who don't look at these sorts of numbers, Hispanics actually have had lower mortality rates than non-Hispanic whites for the last 20 years, and their rates continue to fall at about 2% a year. So it's really this white non-Hispanic group that's seen this dramatic increase. And
it's not just, if I may jump in here, it's not just the increase in mortality, but it's the cause of death that is so striking.
The causes of death that are actually leading the way here, which, as you said, deaths of despair, suicide, drug overdose, either prescription drug or illegal drugs, and alcohol-related diseases, so alcoholic liver disease and cirrhosis. And all three of them have been climbing since the late 1990s. And in fact, for drug overdoses and suicides, those mortality rates have gone up for every education group. But it's just that when you put together all of the numbers, the all-cause mortality is big enough to drive that up for people with a high school degree or less. People with some college, their all-cause mortality has been flat over this period, and people with a college degree, 4-year college degree or more, their all-cause mortality rates are falling, but only slightly, much slower than, say, the countries in Europe, much slower than Hispanic Americans. So all white non-Hispanics seem to be touched by this, but indeed it's concentrated among people with a high school degree or less.
So if I'm to understand correctly, these problems are rising for all groups of whites, but it is this cohort, the middle-aged whites with a high school education, where death rates overall are increasing. So that's what makes that group stand out the most?
That's what I think the standout is. That's, I think, part of what got people's attention was the fact that this problem, which everyone had heard rumblings about, obviously, but that it was big enough that it was actually driving up the all-cause mortality rates. Yeah.
And now we reach a point, I guess, where there's the data and then there's what might or might not be inferred from the data. And I recognize that we don't know what we don't know. But having said that, you yourself have written that we can only speculate about whether rising economic inequality plays a role in the increasing disparity among those who die from deaths of despair. But you have noted that while lower skilled jobs have also declined in European nations, they have not experienced the same kind of rise in deaths among middle-aged people. So that leads one to wonder, is that a matter of the social safety net? Is it a matter of the general tenor of the society in which they're living versus our society? Is it a combination of factors? What are your thoughts on that?
I have many thoughts on that, but I'll also repeat that at this point, we can speculate, and certainly a lot of people have speculated. I mean, I think people look at these results, and it's sort of a Rorschach test of sorts, that people see this and they say, "Aha, this is the reason why." So we will do a lot more work on this, but I think here are the working hypotheses about why things might be different in Europe. As you say, they have a much stronger social safety net. There's universal health care, which probably makes a big difference. There are still defined benefit pension plans instead of defined contribution pension plans, which also means as people move toward retirement, they're more secure in terms of what they will have to live on. It's also the case, though, that the Europeans have been much more careful about allowing heavy-duty prescription opioids to be prescribed to patients for pain. And while we think that the epidemic of opioid overdose is really just a proximate cause, there must be deeper causes that people have turned to those. As a proximate cause, it's clear that the fact that it was very easy to get a prescription to a drug that was stronger than morphine on a regular basis has been one of the things that has caused mortality rates to rise for this subpopulation in the U.S. And the Europeans have been much stricter in terms of their opioid prescription policies. So we think that those factors probably both play a role. It's also possible that in the U.S., whites had a particular narrative for their lives about the way their lives would go, about their ability to get ahead, about their children's ability to get ahead. And then when manufacturing jobs were exported in very large numbers, when the kinds of jobs that they could get with a high school degree did not include on-the-job training, did not include good benefits, and they don't see themselves in a position where they could actually even apply for jobs that would lead to something better, that might be part of the problem here as well.
You know, it strikes me, Professor Ann Case, in looking at this whole issue of the white deaths of despair, that in order to probe, really try to get further with it, I know this economists feel they can solve every problem, but it seems like a classic kind of a topic for interdisciplinary study, because there are medical dimensions to this problem, there are psychological dimensions to this problem, sociological dimensions, as well as economic. Is there any thought going forward about I'm not an advocate for or against interdisciplinary studies per se, but is there any thought as to how to involve other disciplines in this going forward?
Oh, absolutely. We're talking right now with colleagues of ours in the anthropology department who have worked with populations that have struggled, and we're thinking about doing joint work. So hypotheses and data, and some of the data helping to drive the questions that might be asked, but then to go out and do ethnographic work to try to see what role do churches play. Do they play the same roles that they used to play? Bob Putnam has a new book where he looks at people and people's sense of where their lives are going and where their children will go. So we think sociology, anthropology, good ethnographic work, and certainly the medical community as well. I mean, a part of our paper that didn't get a lot of attention, but we think is quite important, is that we were able to report on the fact that it's not just mortality. People in middle age are reporting themselves in worse health. They have more pain.
Yeah.
They have more mental distress.
I was looking at that. Yeah. I was looking at that table right now as you were saying that they're reporting more mental health problems, the activities of daily living, are walking and so on, climbing stairs, that there seem to be increases there as well, which gets into the whole question of the relationship between emotional well-being, physical well-being, which causes which, those sorts of things, right?
Those sorts of things, and those things I think are central. I mean, one of the columns or rows in that table talks about how much difficulty people have socializing. And we know that social isolation is a trigger for suicide. Pain is a trigger for suicide. And we know that we don't really fully understand the connection between stress, anxiety, pain, and people's the choices people make when they're feeling those things. So, and the kind of how connected people feel. One of the things that we want to push forward on is, say, marital status. Unfortunately, on death records, it doesn't ask were you connected with a church. It doesn't ask were you living close to your children. But there are other ways into that question, and I think all of those need to be pursued.
And, one last observation I'd love to run by, and we're talking with Ann Case, professor of economics and co-author of the study on mortality that received a great deal of attention recently, which is your study, rightfully, I think, has been embraced by people on the left who find it meaningful and something worth discussing. But there's also a tendency, and I will say that as a self-identified person of the left, there is a tendency at times, I think, to dismiss the plight of middle-class white people, middle-aged white people, and without, denigrating anybody or dismissing the critical issues of race and other matters in this country. What strikes me, underlying all the data you and Professor Dietmar have unearthed, is it's a terribly sad story.
isn't it?
It is a terribly sad story, and I think that both on the left and on the right, there are candidates in 2016 who are trying to reach out to these people who feel like they've been invisible for a very long time. And I think that the kind of economic pressure, the kind of disintegration possibly in social networks that people have lived with now for 10, 20, 30 years, and can eventually erode away at people's bodies, at people's sense of self, and people's mental well-being. And I think that both the left and the right are tapping into that in this election cycle going on now.
And obviously there are two ways to do that. One is by dividing, and I would argue that one presidential candidate is doing that, and the other is by pointing out the commonalities of interest that people in many different groups share economically and otherwise, and I would argue that another candidate is doing that. But in any case, it's very, very compelling, and as we see in the news just this week, it is dangerous. It can create social instability when a group feels despair and no hope for the future. So I think the study that you and Angus Deaton have done and continue to do in this area is very, very important. And Ann Case, I thank you very much for coming on the program.
It's been my pleasure. Thank you so much, Richard.
America has always prided itself on being the land of opportunity. That image, for many people, is fading. Nobel Prize-winning economist Angus Deaton and his wife, fellow Princeton professor Ann Case, say that for the majority, the reality of the American dream is disappearing.
I do worry about a world in which the rich get to write the rules, which the rest of us then have to obey.
In this episode of Moving Upstream, I head to Princeton to find out what has led these provocative thinkers to ring the alarm bells.
This 250-year experiment we've had with democracy could be coming to an end.
Might be on the edge of a precipice.
Professors Deaton and Case are on a mission to solve a mystery. What's behind the decades-long rise in suicide rates in America? And what does it say about our country?
In every state in prime age, whites' deaths from suicide went up between 1999 and 2016. But we think it's a real sign that something is not right.
The professors note that the suicide rate among middle-aged African Americans isn't on the rise, and it's far lower than that of whites.
Even though whites are wealthier, within an African American community, you feel you are part of a community.
It's also important to note that since 2015, when they did the analysis for blacks without a bachelor's degree, they found that the number of deaths of despair for them from 2015, 16, and 17 started to increase at a rate similar to that for white Americans without a bachelor's degree.
Suicides are striking especially hard in a most unlikely area, one where the myth of America was made.
There's a suicide belt in America right up the Rocky Mountains.
Arizona, New Mexico, all the way up through
Alaska.
Montana, and then if you actually went further into Alaska.
Is that really a thing, a suicide belt?
That's what they call it. Do a colored map of the U.S. showing where suicide rate is higher. It looks like the Rocky Mountains.
Are we talking about despair caused by economic hardship, or is it something in the spirit of America?
I think economics may trigger some of these things, but in the end, it's a failure of spiritual and social life that drives people to suicide.
Is it reasonable to think that if some of these people had more money, that they wouldn't fall into the pits of despair?
I don't think anyone doubts that if they had more money, they'd be better off, right? I mean, for economists, that problem. But you can't link these deaths to having more money or less money. It just doesn't work.
If you take a look at the data from the Great Recession, you see what they mean. Even though the economy tanked and many Americans lost their savings, it didn't significantly move the suicide trend line.
You used the term deaths of despair. Did you guys coin that?
Yeah.
The addiction thing is so close to suicide. Some of the opioid doctors talk about a lost generation.
One of the things that intrigues the researchers is that it seems to be a North American phenomenon.
This is where the comparison with Europe is very important, because you don't really see deaths of despair.
Though in Southern Europe, you do see really high unemployment, particularly for young people.
We're not talking about unemployment here. It's much more to do with these, things that you would correlate with the spiritual crisis.
The Europeans are not killing themselves the way that the Americans are.
They've lost jobs. Technological changes come to Europe.
So one of the places our research will go next is what are the big differences between the Europeans and the Americans, that it's helping the Europeans keep body and soul together.
Deaton and Case offer some theories. One, the breakdown of families.
The things that make people want to kill themselves or lose the meaning of life are to do with things like your marriage has never worked out. You don't know your kids anymore.
Social bonds deteriorating. Is that what we're talking about?
Another theory, Americans making a religious migration to churches that Case thinks are changing the way faith connects in the community.
And you've said something really provocative on this. You've singled out the evangelical church.
That is a church that more people are identifying with, and it's a church which encourages my personal relationship with my Savior. It's a very individual experience, whereas the mainline Protestant churches or the Catholic Church would be you're part of a community.
We've nothing against the evangelical churches, and we're certainly not correlating the evangelicals with the deaths. We don't have the data for that. But one of the things you might think if a community is coming apart is you see less religious observance, and you do not.
But there is one correlation they find in the numbers.
All this bad stuff, by and large, is happening to people who do not have a BA. And people who do have a BA are largely exempt from this. The economy is no longer offering a good life to people without a university degree.
People in the U.S. that only have a high school diploma are more than twice as likely to kill themselves as those who hold a college degree. Today, fewer than a third of Americans ultimately earn a bachelor's degree before reaching the age of 29.
If we can only generate good lives for an elite that's about a third of the population, then we have a real problem.
The real problem, as Deaton and Case see it, is that deaths of despair are an indicator.
So, I would go as far as to say if we can't fix this, it really is a crisis of capitalism. It doesn't seem to be working for people who are not very well educated. Up until the Second World War, the dominant intellectual views then was that capitalism was sort of broken.
Little man, what now?
There were a lot of people who were flirting with communism or socialism in one form or another. And what seemed to happen after the Second World War is that it started delivering for more or less everybody. And so you got this long period from 1945 through to the early 70s when all boats rose together. Working class people, people without a college degree who entered the labor market around 1970 had a great world. That was a world in which you could belong to a union. There was a fabric of working class life which looked like it was going to go on forever. And that world has been sort of coming apart since 1970. Median wages in real terms have been pretty stagnant for 50 years.
The professors think conditions are ripe in America for one of two things to happen. One, a resurgent left declaring war on laissez-faire economics.
Capitalism in America is much more anti-worker than it is in Europe. The income tax rates are not very different from what they are here. But in Europe, there's a value-added tax that generates a huge amount of revenue, which is used to maintain an elaborate social safety net. We don't have that here.
We've produced the Bill Gateses, the Mark Zuckerbergs, the Steve Jobses. They've come from America, not from Europe. Some of the greatest minds on this planet have emerged from this society.
Well, a lot of them are immigrants. Something like half of the Fortune 500 companies were started by immigrants. The year I got the Nobel Prize, there were 4 Americans. 3 of us were immigrants. Do we have a free society? We don't look after each other. And in the end, it's rough and tumble. A lot of people fall through the cracks. But on average, we do well, right? But the question is on average we do well okay if it's only the top third? If it's only the people with BAs? In the end, you'd want a world where people don't have to go to college, right?
The other possibility, with inequality reaching such a high level, they say it may be the fabric of our society that could be the next casualty.
When you see a society's life expectancy beginning to tip over for like 3 years in a row, which it has been for whites and 2 years for the whole population, the only time that's happened before was, because of smoking. So this is, that does suggest that something really bad is going on under the surface.
Canary in a coal mine kind of situation?
Yes, exactly. And that's very worrying. And the world is a much better place, but it's a very fragile place. What happens if, say, the stock market fell by 50% again? You could have some constitutional crisis. You could have a lot of things like that would go together. North Korea is the most obvious thing. Put a couple of those things together and the world would not look quite such a happy place.
These acclaimed Princeton professors think the American ideal of self-reliance is, due to changes in the economy, becoming outdated. Is the isolation and despair being experienced by so many people in this country, less educated whites in particular, pushing us towards some sort of crisis? What do you think? We look forward to reading your comments.
Anne Case and Angus Deaton famously chronicled a dramatic rise in deaths of despair, that is, deaths by suicide, drug abuse, or alcohol abuse. We at the Social Capital Project have extended Case and Deaton's research back by nearly 120 years. We have found that mortality from deaths of despair has now far surpassed anything seen in America since the dawn of the 20th century. The increase has been driven primarily by an unprecedented epidemic of drug overdoses. But even excluding overdose deaths, the combined mortality rate from suicide and alcohol-related death is higher than it has been in over 100 years. In our latest report, Long-Term Trends in Deaths of Despair, we present some of this data, and in a public data file, we provide further breakdowns by age, race, and sex. Case and Deaton have drawn attention to an important public health phenomenon, but we have far to go before understanding its causes and its implications, both for public policy and for the health of our economy, our communities, and our families.
Ordinarily, this beautiful, serene garden would be the perfect place to escape and forget all of your worries. But during this pandemic, it's been very difficult for many people to find peace of mind and almost impossible for others. I'm Tanya McRae in Encino, where I spoke to a psychologist who is trying to help her patients get through these unprecedented times. Helping people who have experienced some type of trauma in their past is what psychologist Dr. Pam Sobo specializes in. But the COVID pandemic has created an entirely new type of trauma for her patients. They're all living it right now.
The main concern of mental health professionals right now is that we educate people on what to do because we are in the trauma now. So some people may not feel that they're in the trauma now and not notice some of the signs and symptoms.
Dr. Sobo says there are different ways people are experiencing and reacting to pandemic-related trauma.
Many people are going to get angry and respond in that way. Some people will go into depression, which is a hypo state.
During a Zoom session with her patient Kat, they discussed the daily impact of pandemic life.
I noticed that kind of hopeless, helpless, don't know if it's worth getting out of bed in the morning. What can I do? Think, the problem seems so big and I feel so small.
The mental dangers related to the COVID pandemic are now as real as the physical dangers of the virus. In a recent study from the Wellbeing Trust, a nonprofit foundation, estimates that COVID-19 may lead to 75,000 additional U.S. deaths by despair, as mass unemployment, social isolation, and uncertainty about the future are increasing drug and alcohol misuse and suicides.
Nobody knows when this will end and how it's going to affect them on all of the different levels. And that is what has most people very concerned.
Dr. Sobo is telling her patients to look out for the signs of pandemic-related issues, including severe irritability, constant anxiety, rage, and chronic fatigue. While COVID restrictions have prevented people from doing many things, Dr. Sobo says it's important to create a self-care routine, doing things that bring you some joy.
So you've talked about things that are meditative, that really soothe you.
So I can always grab a brush and do some painting, which helps me kind of reconnect, and it's almost like a meditation.
And although we can't stop the pandemic, she encourages people to focus on the things they can control.
Stay in touch with the people you know. Reach out every day to somebody. Don't hide. Just keep reaching out. Even if it's really hard for you, reach out.
Keeping hope alive is now a crucial part of keeping people alive.